I never thought my life would end up like this. Standing on a cold Chicago sidewalk, staring at the very house I once called home. The autumn wind cuts across the street, carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant traffic. Behind that door, the laughter of my children used to echo through every room. Now, I'm not even allowed to knock. My name is David Ross, and for most of my life, I believed that love, real, unshakable love, could survive anything. I believed it the day I carried my firstborn into this world, the night I painted the nursery walls a soft shade of blue, even though we didn't know if we were having a boy or a girl. I believed it every time I left a 12-hour shift at St. Mary's Hospital and came home to little faces waiting at the window. I believed it so fiercely that I worked until my back gave out and my hair turned gray, because fathers are supposed to protect, provide, and forgive. But belief is a fragile thing. It can crack without a sound and leave you standing in front of a locked door wondering how the people you raised could forget the very hands that fed them. I was 24 when my first child, Ethan, was born. Back then, Chicago winters felt less cruel. I was a young father with a young wife, Claire, and a heart too big for my own chest. We had a tiny apartment above a grocery store in Pilsen. The walls were thin, the rent was late more often than not, but our dreams were loud enough to drown out the trains that rattled past at midnight. Money was always a shadow over our shoulders. I worked double shifts as a paramedic at St. Mary's, racing through the city in an ambulance that smelled of antiseptic and diesel. Each call was a reminder of how fragile life could be. Heart attacks on icy sidewalks, car crashes on Lakeshore Drive, overdoses in alleyways. Each time I carried someone else's pain, I swore my own children would never feel the kind of fear I saw in those eyes. I saved every extra dollar, skipped meals, and patched my boots with duct tape just so we could put a down payment on a modest brick house on the south side. When we finally signed the papers, I felt like I'd conquered the world. That house wasn't big. The paint peeled in places and the basement smelled faintly of damp earth. But it was ours. I still remember the night we moved in. Ethan sleeping on a pile of blankets, Claire leaning against my shoulder as we ate takeout Chinese on the living room floor. We promised each other that no matter how hard life became, this house would always be a place of love. 2 years later, our daughter Lily arrived. She had eyes as bright as the morning sky and a cry that could wake every neighbor on the block. I used to rock her at 3 a.m., whispering stories about the world she would one day explore. I told her she could be anything, a doctor, a dancer, a poet, and she'd gurgle as if she believed me. For years, our home overflowed with laughter. Birthday candles flickered against the kitchen walls. Ethan built forts out of couch cushions. Lily painted the hallway with her tiny paint-smeared fingers. We were far from perfect. Arguments about bills, long nights when Claire and I barely spoke. But love always pulled us back. Then life began to tilt. Claire's health started to fail when the kids reached their teens. Doctors used words like autoimmune and chronic. Hospital visits became routine. I took extra shifts to cover medical bills, often coming home long after midnight. The children, once wide-eyed and eager for bedtime stories, grew restless and distant. Ethan discovered the freedom of late-night parties. Lily hid behind headphones and half-truths. I tried to be both father and mother, but exhaustion dulled my patience. Every missed dinner felt like a small betrayal, and every slammed door echoed louder in a house that was starting to feel too big. When Claire passed away, something in our family cracked. Grief settled over us like the heavy Chicago snow. I thought losing her would pull us closer. Instead, it pushed us apart. Ethan stopped answering my calls when he stayed out late. Lily rolled her eyes when I asked simple questions. I chalked it up to teenage pain, telling myself they needed time. But time didn't heal. It hardened. One evening, after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift, I came home to find Ethan in the living room with two of his friends. Beer cans littered the coffee table. When I asked him to clean up, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Why should I listen to you? You're barely even here." The words hit like a fist. I wanted to explain about the bills, the hospital debts, the endless nights of lifting patients and carrying strangers through blizzards, but my throat tightened, and all I managed was a quiet, "I'm trying." He shrugged, as if trying wasn't enough. From that night on, the distance grew. Ethan began to treat me not as a father, but as a roommate who paid the mortgage. Lily followed his lead. Her teenage rebellion sharpened into cold indifference. I kept hoping that if I worked harder, if I cooked their favorite meals, if I paid for their college applications, they would remember the man who once rocked them to sleep. But hope is a stubborn, fragile thing. Before I go deeper, if this story touches you even a little, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps me share more real stories like this one. And I'd love to hear from you. Write in the comments from which country you're watching and what time it is there right now. It amazes me how a story from one quiet street in Chicago can reach hearts around the world. Winter arrived early, the year everything truly fell apart. The first snow had barely settled when Ethan announced he was quitting college. He claimed tuition was a waste, that he could make more money his way. When I questioned him, he exploded. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You're just a tired old man who works himself to death for nothing." I stood there, the same man who had once carried him on my shoulders through Lincoln Park Zoo, and listened as my own son reduced me to a shadow. Lily, now 17, rarely spoke to me at all. She spent nights at friends' houses and days locked in her room. When I tried to reach her, she would slip out the door with a cold glance that sliced deeper than any knife. The final blow came on a night I will never forget. I returned from a late ambulance call, an elderly man with chest pain on the north side, to find the front door locked, not just closed, but dead-bolted from the inside. Through the window, I could see Ethan and Lily sitting on the couch, the blue glow of the television washing over their faces. I knocked softly at first, then harder. Ethan stood, walked to the door, and looked at me through the glass. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "This is my house," I said, my breath clouding the cold air. "Not anymore," he replied. "You don't belong here. We need space. You're useless to us." Useless. The word sank like a stone in my chest. For a long moment, neither one of us moved. Then he turned away, leaving me alone in the freezing night.
I spent that night in the ambulance bay at St. Mary's, the sirens outside blending with the roar in my ears. I thought about the diapers I had changed, the meals I had skipped so they could eat, the countless times I had carried them on my shoulders to see fireworks at Navy Pier. Every sacrifice felt like a cruel joke. How does love die in the very place it was born?
Morning crept over Chicago like a gray sheet pulled across a wounded sky. The hospital parking lot smelled of salt and exhaust, and I sat on the cold bumper of my ambulance, my breath fogging the air. I had worked dozens of double shifts over the years, but this was the first time I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. My back ached from the steel bench where I had dozed for an hour, and my chest ached from something no medicine could touch. I kept replaying Ethan's words, "You're useless to us." They weren't just a sentence, they were a door slamming, a lifetime of love shoved into the dark. How could the boy who once clung to my hand in crowded streets now treat me like a stranger begging for warmth? I told myself he was angry, confused, maybe drunk, but deep down I knew those words weren't a slip. They were a verdict. That morning, I clocked in early for my shift. The ER was already alive with chaos. Stretchers lined the hall, monitors beeped, voices called codes in urgent bursts. I threw myself into work because every second spent saving strangers was a second not spent drowning in my own heartbreak. A man with a fractured jaw, a child wheezing with an asthma attack, a woman crying after a car crash, all of them clung to life, and I clung to the rhythm of their emergencies. But no amount of adrenaline could quiet the silence waiting when the shift ended. For years, the thought of coming home, even to a messy kitchen or a slammed teenage door, kept me moving. Now, home was a locked door and faces turned away. I tried calling Ethan during lunch break. No answer. I sent a text, "We need to talk. I love you." The message showed delivered, but never read. I called Lily next, straight to voicemail. Her recorded greeting, cheerful and sweet, stabbed me with memories of a little girl who once raced to hug me at the door. I stared at the phone until the screen dimmed, feeling the weight of years pressing against my ribs. I had held heart monitors and bleeding strangers. I had driven through blizzards to keep people alive, yet I couldn't reach the two people that mattered most. That night, I rented a small room above a diner on 35th Street. It smelled of grease and cigarette smoke, but the landlady, a tired woman named Mrs. Collins, handed me the key without judgment. She said, "Week by week," her eyes kind but cautious. I nodded, grateful for even a thin mattress and a door that would open when I turned the key. Lying on that sagging bed, I thought about the house only a few miles away. Did they eat dinner together? Did they laugh the way we used to? Were they talking about me at all? Or had I already faded like a photograph left in the sun? Days turned into weeks. I worked longer shifts, partly for the overtime and partly to keep from thinking. But every street corner carried ghosts. The park where Ethan learned to ride a bike,
the bakery where Lily begged for cupcakes after school. Even the sound of the L train rumbling overhead felt like a memory I couldn't escape. One evening, after a grueling call that ended in a failed resuscitation, I found myself driving past our house. The curtains were drawn. A faint glow seeped from Ethan's bedroom window. For a fleeting second, I imagined walking up the steps, knocking softly, hearing Lily's voice say, "Dad's home!" But the deadbolt flashed in my mind, and I kept driving. Friends from the hospital noticed the change. "Rough week, man?" my partner Marcus asked as we cleaned the rig after a long shift. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." How could I explain that exhaustion had nothing to do with sleep? How could I tell them, my children, my reason for every late-night call and every extra shift had decided I no longer belonged to them? Marcus handed me a bottle of water and said quietly, "Don't let work eat you alive." If only he knew that work was the only thing keeping me breathing. On a rare day off, I went to the lakefront. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp enough to make my eyes water, though maybe the tears came from somewhere deeper. I watched families stroll along the pier, parents holding tiny mittened hands, children laughing as gulls dove for crumbs. I remembered carrying Ethan on my shoulders during summer fireworks, Lily giggling as she tried to catch falling sparks. Back then, I believed those nights built a bond nothing could break. A little girl skipped past, her father trailing behind with a patient smile. For a moment, our eyes met. He nodded in quiet understanding, the way fathers sometimes do. I nodded back, but inside, something hollowed out a little more. One night, about a month after I was locked out, I received a call from an unknown number. My heart leapt when I heard Lily's voice. "Dad," she whispered, almost too soft to hear, Can you send some money? We're short on the gas bill." Relief and pain tangled in my chest. I wanted to ask if she missed me, if she thought of me at all, but the words caught behind my teeth. I said, "Of course, anything you need." I transferred the money before the call even ended. She didn't say thank you. The line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to call back, to beg for even a single kind word, but I didn't. Love, I've learned, sometimes means giving without expecting anything in return, even when it breaks you. Work became my refuge. Every siren, every frantic call was a chance to matter to someone else. A woman in cardiac arrest who clutched my hand and whispered, "Thank you," as we wheeled her into the ER. A frightened child whose small fingers wrapped around mine during a midnight asthma attack. Strangers still saw me as someone worth saving. It was a cruel comfort, knowing I could be a hero to people I'd never meet again, but a burden to the ones I loved most. One snowy night, Marcus and I responded to a house fire on the west side. Inside, smoke curled like angry ghosts. We found a young boy hiding under a bed, his tiny body trembling. As I carried him out into the freezing air, his arms wrapped tight around my neck, I felt a pang so sharp it nearly dropped me to my knees. For a split second, I imagined Ethan at that age clinging to me with absolute trust. The memory burned hotter than the flames behind us. After the call, Marcus clapped my shoulder. "You okay, man?" "Yeah," I lied, staring at the boy reunited with his sobbing mother, but inside I was anything but okay. Saving lives filled the small corner of the emptiness, but it couldn't touch the silence that waited when I returned to my rented room. One Saturday, I finally gathered the courage to try again. I drove to the house just before dusk, heart pounding like a rookie on his first emergency call. The neighborhood smelled of burning leaves, a scent that once meant cozy nights and family dinners. I climbed the front steps and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Through the frosted glass, I caught a shadow of movement. Someone was there. I pressed my palm against the door. "Ethan, it's Dad. Please, just talk to me." Footsteps approached. For a heartbeat, hope flared. Then Ethan's voice, cold and flat, cut through the wood. "You need to stop coming here. You don't live here anymore. Go back to whatever life you've made for yourself." My throat tightened. "Son, this is still my home. I'm still your father."
I don't know when the distance between me and my children turned into a canyon. Maybe it began with small, quiet choices, missed dinners, rushed phone calls, the way their eyes slid past mine as they grew taller. At first, I told myself it was normal. Kids become teenagers, teenagers become adults, and parents step back. That's the way life moves. But in our small Chicago apartment, the air started to feel different. Conversations shortened to single-word replies. Doors closed a little too quickly. Laughter no longer floated through the hallway like it once had. I tried to fight it in small ways. I cooked their favorite meals, pancakes drowned in syrup, late-night grilled cheese with extra butter. I waited up after their shifts and study sessions, hoping for a few minutes of casual talk. Most nights they walked past me with earbuds in, nodding without looking. My daughter Anna still offered a tired smile now and then, but even she seemed to guard her words. My son Mark had perfected a polite, distant tone that made me feel like a stranger, renting a room in my own home. I worked double shifts as a warehouse supervisor, my back screaming by the end of every week. Every box I lifted, every overtime hour I signed carried the same thought. They'll see how much I love them when they grow older. They'll understand why I stayed up nights worrying about bills. I believed sacrifice was a language children eventually learned to read. But my children seemed to be learning a different language altogether, one that didn't need me in the grammar. The first crack came one chilly November evening. Chicago's wind cut sharp against the windows, rattling them like a warning. I came home to find Mark sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. I tried a soft approach. "How was class today, champ?" I asked, using the nickname I'd given him when he was 5. He didn't look up. "Fine." One word, flat. "Anything interesting happen?" "No." His thumbs kept moving across the screen. I sat across from him, heart beating louder than the ticking clock. "You know, we haven't really talked lately. Maybe we could grab a bite this weekend. My treat." He finally looked at me, eyes cold in a way I didn't recognize. "I'm busy." The words themselves weren't cruel. It was the weight behind them. Busy. Too busy for the man who once carried him on shoulders through Lincoln Park Zoo, who stayed up all night when fever burned through his little body. I nodded like it was nothing, but inside, something heavy began to shift. Weeks passed. The silence grew thicker.
When I tried to talk about rent or chores, Mark's jaw tightened and avoided the room altogether. I started leaving notes on the fridge because face-to-face conversations ended with sighs and slammed doors. Friends at work noticed the gray in my hair spreading faster, but I shrugged it off. How could I explain that my greatest fear wasn't aging? It was disappearing from the lives of the very people I lived for. Then came the night that still echoes in my chest. It was late February. Snow whipped across the streetlights, painting the city in cold, blinding white. I came home early, an unexpected blessing, I thought, to find Mark in the living room, pacing. His shoulders were tense, fists tight. Anna stood near the door, eyes red. I felt the pressure before anyone spoke. "What's going on?" I asked carefully. Mark stopped pacing. "We need to talk." Nothing good ever follows those 4 words. He didn't ease into it. "Dad, you need to find your own place." I thought I misheard. My own place? "This apartment," he said, voice hard. "Anna and I want to manage it ourselves. We need space. You make things tense." The room tilted. I gripped the back of the couch to stay upright. "I pay the rent," I managed. "This is our home." "It was," he shot back, "but you're always hovering. It's uncomfortable." Hovering. The word sliced through me. Every late-night check-in, every meal cooked, every quiet attempt to stay connected, reduced to hovering. "Mark," I whispered, "I'm your father. This is where I belong." "No," he said, eyes burning, "not anymore." Anna tried to speak, but Mark raised a hand, silencing her. I saw apology in her eyes, but no rescue. My own children stood united across from me, and I felt the floor beneath decades of sacrifice give way. The warmth of Chicago's radiators couldn't fight the sudden ice in my veins. I wanted to argue, to remind them of the nights I worked until dawn, of the shoes I went without so they could have new ones, of the birthday cakes baked on borrowed hours. But every memory felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter if I touched it. Instead, I swallowed the storm and nodded once. "If that's what you both want," I said quietly, "I'll start looking." Mark's shoulders eased, but he didn't thank me. He just turned away, his phone buzzing in his hand. Anna whispered a soft, "I'm sorry, Dad," but the words floated uselessly in the frozen air. I walked to my room and closed the door, each step heavier than the last. Inside, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the worn carpet, the same carpet where my children once played with toy cars and stuffed animals. I remembered Mark's giggles when I built blanket forts, Anna's tiny fingers gripping mine on stormy nights. All of it replayed like an old home video no one wanted to watch anymore. I didn't sleep. I barely breathed. I thought of calling a friend, but shame sealed my mouth. How do you tell someone that the people you gave everything for have decided you are unnecessary? That love poured out for decades can be voted out of a home with a single conversation? The next morning, Mark left for work without a word. Anna lingered in the hallway, eyes swollen from tears. "Dad, it's not that we don't love you, we need our own lives." I forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. "Of course," I said, "I understand." But I didn't understand. Not then, not now. Love isn't a lease you can end. Parenthood doesn't expire when children grow tall. Yet there I was, a man of 53, suddenly a guest in the home he built from paychecks and dreams. That night, I wandered the icy streets of Chicago, past neon diners and silent apartment blocks. The wind howled against my coat, but it wasn't the cold that hurt. It was the thought that somewhere behind those glowing windows, families were laughing over dinner, while my own children planned a future without me. Every lighted room felt like a cruel reminder of the warmth I had lost. I stopped on a bridge overlooking the frozen Chicago River. Cars hissed across slick pavement below. My reflection stared back from the dark water. Older, thinner, a man hollowed out by invisible hands. I gripped the railing until my knuckles whitened and whispered to the night, "Where did I go wrong?" No answer came. Only the endless rush of the river beneath the ice.
The morning after Mark's ultimatum, Chicago wore a dull gray coat of clouds that hung heavy over the city. I woke before dawn, as I always did, but the air in the apartment felt different. It was no longer our home. It was a space that tolerated me only until I could find somewhere else to go. Every sound, the hiss of the radiator, the creak of the hallway board seemed sharper, like the walls themselves were pushing me out. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from the mug. I had raised my children to be strong, independent adults. In theory, this is what every parent wanted, for their children to fly on their own. But I had imagined a gentle parting, one filled with hugs and words of gratitude, not a cold vote to evict me from the life I had built for them. Mark walked in, shoulders square, dressed for work. He didn't sit. "I've got a late shift tonight," he said flatly. "If you need help finding a place, there's a listing board at the community center." Not a single glance at the coffee or at me, just instructions like I was a tenant being relocated. I wanted to tell him I didn't need his help. I wanted to remind him that I once held his tiny body through fevers and fears, that I had stood in freezing lines for school enrollment so he would have a better future. Instead, I nodded. "Thanks," I managed, the word tasting bitter. Anna joined us, her soft steps a contrast to Mark's heavy ones. She carried the gentleness of her late mother, but her eyes carried guilt that seemed to weigh her down. "Dad," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we can help you look for something nearby so we can still visit." I forced a smile. "We'll see," I said. Inside, I wanted to shout, "Don't you see what this means?" But I swallowed the storm again. My love for them, twisted and bruised as it felt, still held me back from words that might scar them forever. That day I visited the community center. The bulletin board was littered with index cards and printed sheets advertising rooms for rent, basement studios, shared spaces. I scanned each one like a man searching for a lifeline. Most were too expensive, some were too far. Others were written in scrawled handwriting that hinted at questionable landlords. An elderly volunteer at the front desk noticed me lingering. "Looking for something?" she asked kindly. "Just a small place," I said. "Something simple." Her eyes softened. Maybe she sensed the story behind my thin smile. "It's tough out there, but you'll find something." I thanked her and pocketed a few listings, the paper feeling heavier than it should. On the bus ride back, the city blurred past the fogged windows. I saw fathers walking with children in puffy winter coats, little hands gripping big ones. I wondered if those fathers knew how fragile their place in the world really was. One day you're the center of their universe. The next you're just another passenger watching families through glass. That evening I began packing. Each object carried a memory sharp enough to cut. The dented metal lunchbox I carried on double shifts, the one Mark used to decorate with stickers. Anna's kindergarten painting of a yellow sun, still taped to the back of my closet door. A photo of their mother, smiling in a summer dress, taken before illness took us from us. I held that photo for a long time. After their mother passed, I promised her, silently, to the quiet hospital room, that I would raise their children with every ounce of love in me. I had kept that promise through sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and lonely holidays, and yet here I was, folding shirts into a bag because love wasn't enough to secure a place in their future. Mark came home late. I heard his key in the lock, the soft thud of his shoes on the mat. He peeked into my room, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to rush," he said, flatly. "Take your time." His voice held no warmth, only a rehearsed civility. "I know," I replied, without looking up. I wanted to ask him, "Why, Mark? Why the sudden urgency to remove me from a life we built together?" But I feared the answer. Maybe he would say I was too old, too needy, too something. Maybe he would tell me that my presence embarrassed him, that he wanted a life untouched by the man who sacrificed everything. The possibilities scared me more than silence. Anna slipped in after him, carrying a plate of reheated dinner. "You need to eat," she said, gently. "Thank you," I whispered. Her kindness cut deeper than Mark's coldness because it reminded me of what I was losing, not just a home, but the everyday gestures of family. The next week was a blur of cardboard boxes and heavy memories. I found a small room in a boarding house on the south side, barely larger than the storage closet at the apartment. The landlord was a tired man with nicotine-stained fingers. He didn't ask many questions. I handed over the deposit and the first month's rent, my hands trembling slightly. Moving day arrived with a cruel brightness. Sunlight poured through the apartment windows, as if mocking the heaviness inside me. Mark helped carry a few boxes to the car, his movements efficient but distant. Anna hovered nearby, biting her lip. At the doorway, I turned to take one last look. The living room still smelled faintly of the Sunday breakfasts I used to cook. The couch bore the faint indentations of movie nights and sick day naps. Every corner of that place held echoes of laughter that now belonged to someone else's future. Anna hugged me tightly, her tears soaking into my jacket. "Please visit," she whispered. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Mark extended his hand instead of a hug. I shook it, feeling the rough calluses of his warehouse job, the same job I once helped him apply for. His grip was firm, but brief. No words of gratitude, no "I love you," just a handshake between strangers. The boarding house smelled faintly of bleach and old wood. My room contained a narrow bed, a small desk, and a single window overlooking an alley.
I unpacked slowly, each item a reminder of the life that had been boxed away. The walls were bare, but they seemed to echo with the ghosts of my children's laughter. The first night was the hardest. The silence was too deep, too final. I lay awake listening to the hum of distant traffic, my heart replaying every sacrifice, every bedtime story I once kissed. I wondered if Mark and Anna were eating dinner without noticing my absence. Did they feel relief? Did they feel guilt? Or was I already fading into their background like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer? I found myself walking through Chicago in the evenings, drifting past the familiar neighborhoods where we once lived as a young family. I passed the park where I taught them to ride bikes, the ice cream shop where Anna dropped her cone and cried until I bought another. Each landmark felt like a museum exhibit of a love that no longer existed in the present tense. One rainy night, I ducked into a small diner for warmth. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, brought me coffee without asking. She must have seen something in my face because she lingered. "Rough day?" she asked. I managed a sad smile. "Rough year." "Kids?" she guessed. I nodded. Somehow she understood. Maybe she had her own story of distance and loss. "Sometimes they come back," she said softly. "Sometimes they don't, but you keep living anyway." Her words settled over me like a thin blanket, comforting but not enough to erase the cold.
The days after I settled into the boarding house unfolded like a gray Chicago winter, monotonous, cold, and strangely endless. Each morning I woke to the sound of pipes clanking in the walls and the faint smell of stale coffee from the communal kitchen down the hall. My room was barely larger than the closet back at the apartment, but it was clean enough. A single window overlooked a narrow alley where delivery trucks rattled past at dawn, their engines echoing off the brick walls. On paper, it was a place to live. In my chest, it felt like a waiting room for someone who no longer had a destination. I tried to keep a routine. Old habits from years of raising children die hard. I rose early, made my bed with military precision, and brewed a small pot of coffee on the hot plate I'd bought at a second-hand shop. The smell brought a fleeting comfort, but it also carried memories of breakfasts cooked for Mark and Anna. Pancakes sizzling, bacon crackling, their sleepy faces slowly waking to the day. Those mornings had once been my joy. Now the silence after the coffee finished brewing seemed to mock me. At work, I became a master of small talk. Co-workers chatted about their kids' soccer games and college applications, unaware that every story landed like a stone in my chest. I smiled when they spoke of family vacations, nodded when they shared frustrations about teenage moods. Inside, I ached to confess that my children had chosen a life without me. But pride sealed my lips. I told myself no one needed to see the father who had been quietly discarded. Evenings were the hardest. The boarding house residents were a rotating cast of lonely souls, divorced men, young workers between apartments, retirees clinging to independence. We shared nods in the hallway, sometimes a brief conversation over microwave dinners. Yet the loneliness remained stubborn, a shadow that followed me back to my small room. I often wandered the city after work. Chicago at night is a strange comfort.
its streets alive with neon signs, music spilling from bars, and the low hum of trains overhead. I'd walk past restaurants where families shared meals, the clatter of silverware mixing with bursts of laughter. I would pause outside the windows for a moment too long, pretending I was just admiring the lights, when in truth I was trying to remember what it felt like to sit across from my children and hear them laugh without reservation. One Thursday evening, snow began to fall in lazy spirals, softening the city's harsh edges. I found myself drawn back to the block where our apartment stood. From the street, I could see the faint glow of the living room lamp through the curtains. I imagined Anna curled on the couch with a book, Mark scrolling on his phone, the radiator humming its steady tune. For a moment, I allowed myself the fantasy that I would climb the steps, knock on the door, and hear their voices welcome me back. Instead, I stood across the street, my breath forming pale clouds in the icy air, and watched the home that no longer held a place for me. As the snow thickened, a memory returned, one of those small, tender moments that seem unremarkable until life takes them away. Mark was 8, Anna 6. A storm had knocked out the power, and we spent the evening huddled around candles, playing board games by flickering light. They had laughed until they cried when I pretended to be a pirate, chasing them around the darkened apartment. That night, Anna had whispered, "Daddy, promise we'll always be together." I promised without hesitation. Children believe promises are forever. So do fathers, until reality proves otherwise. Weeks passed. Text messages from Anna arrived less frequently. Mark almost never replied. I told myself they were busy. Jobs, friends, the excitement of young adulthood. But late at night, the silence felt deliberate, like a door slowly closing. One Saturday morning, I received a rare call from Anna. Her voice was careful, like someone crossing a thin sheet of ice. "Hi, Dad," she began. "I just wanted to check in." My heart leapt at the sound of her voice. "Hi, sweetheart. How's everything?" "It's okay," she said after a pause. "Mark's working a lot. I'm thinking of applying for a promotion." "That's wonderful," I said, trying to keep the joy from sounding too desperate. "I'm proud of you." There was a long silence. I could hear the faint hum of the apartment radiator in the background. It was the sound of a life that used to include me. "Dad," she said finally, "are you okay?" The question nearly broke me. I wanted to tell her about the night staring at the ceiling, about the emptiness of a room too small to hold a lifetime of love, but I couldn't. "I'm fine," I lied, "just taking it one day at a time." "I'm glad," she whispered, though her voice carried the weight of guilt. Before hanging up, she added, "Please don't stop calling, even if we're slow to answer." Her words were both a balm and a blade. They acknowledged my absence, but offered no promise of closeness. After the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, and wept for the first time since leaving. The tears came silently, soaking the worn blanket beneath me. I cried for the little girl who once clung to my leg, for the boy who once thought I could fix anything, and for the man I had become, unwanted in the very lives he built. Loneliness has a strange way of teaching resilience. I began to fill my hours with small acts of survival. I joined a book club at the library, where strangers discussed stories of love and loss. I volunteered at a food pantry on weekends, lifting boxes and sharing quiet conversations with people who understood displacement. Each interaction reminded me that pain is universal. We all are in some way carrying the weight of someone else's absence. But even as I tried to build a new life, memories of my children remained sharp. Certain smells, fresh laundry, cinnamon pancakes, the faint scent of rain on pavement would open a floodgate of images. I would see Mark running into my arms after his first soccer goal, Anna proudly holding up a crayon drawing of our family. Those memories, once a source of joy, now felt like delicate glass, beautiful but dangerous to touch. One night, while walking along the lakefront, I overheard a young man arguing with his father over the phone. His voice was harsh, impatient. "I don't need your advice, Dad. Just stop calling me," he shouted before hanging up. I watched him storm away, earbuds back in place, leaving his father's unheard words lost to the wind. I wanted to stop him, to tell him that one day he might ache for the sound of his father's voice, but I said nothing. Perhaps he needed to make his own mistakes before understanding the value of what he was rejecting. As spring crept into Chicago, small signs of renewal appeared. Buds formed on the trees along Michigan Avenue. Children rode scooters along the sidewalks, their laughter carrying on the warmer air. Life, indifferent to my heartbreak, moved forward. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the alley lights flicker, a realization settled over me like the first gentle warmth of April. My love for Mark and Anna was not diminished by their rejection. Love, real love, is not a contract to be signed or broken. It is a river that flows even when the banks crumble. They may never fully understand the sacrifices I made. They may never invite me back into their daily lives. But my love remains. It exists beyond doors, beyond apartments, beyond the painful silence of unanswered texts.